Good morning. It's great to have you watching video number 2 in our worst case scenario thinking series. Today's Tuesday, and it's beautiful but incredibly humid, like oppressively humid here in Palm Coast. I went for a run this morning, and it felt like I was running through water. It was kind of crazy. But I hope your week has gotten off to a great start. Yesterday was the first day of school for students here in Flagler County, and I'm excited for them, and I pray for an amazing start to a very strange year for our students and for parents and for everybody involved. Yesterday afternoon, I took a short break and went for a run, and it was around the time that school was letting out, and it was refreshing to see parents lining up to pick up their kids. It's just something about that kind of return to normalcy or something like that. So I pray for good health and a successful restart to the school year. Not really a restart, I guess it's a fresh start, but I pray for a successful start to the school year. Anyway, yesterday I introduced the idea of worst case scenario thinking, WCST. It takes the most extreme outcome and obsesses with it and teaches you to live life accordingly. It's worrying about the worst possible outcome and believing that this outcome is likely or even most likely. It's not simple preparation for a negative outcome. That by itself is part of how we successfully navigate this world. You have to be prepared for different possibilities and know how you interact in those circumstances. For example, you wear your seatbelt when you're driving. You have ABS systems in cars, and you follow the speed limit. Those are just common sense steps in a world in which we understand there can be some negative consequences if we don't do that. Worst case scenario thinking instead is obsessing with the worst possible, the most extreme outcome. I make the case that we as a society have grown more and more accustomed to that. That's what I'm laying out. We see the media sensationalizing every sickness, murder, weather event, and things like that. And here's the thing, the media does it because we want. It's not as though there's some sort of entity separate from us doing this to us. It's just that the negative, the divisive, the extreme, the worst case, that's what we want. Personally, I'd love it if West News just once for the evening news just showed 30 minutes of local kittens and puppies playing. That would be awesome. But I know that's not realistic, and it's not particularly healthy either. I think there has to be some kind of balance out there. There's some sort of healthy balance out there as we think about taking the world in. So we do it as a society, we also do it individually. Yesterday I mentioned waking up at 3 in the morning and obsessing with stressors in our lives. That resonated with some of you. I've got some comments, I got some messages. Man, am I ever guilty of this? I do this. I'm speaking from experience. So you're not alone if you worry about the negative in your life. Again, there's a healthy balance between preparing and responding to stressors in life versus obsessing with the worst possible outcome. So what does all this worrying do? Jesus points out the futility of worrying in part of his Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to bring up a slide here. Okay, so you see a Bible verse there from Matthew 5, verse 27. And I'm pulling this out of the context of the whole passage. I understand. I think that you can kind of get the idea or the point of the whole passage. When Jesus says, which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to your life? Well, the answer, Jesus is moving toward, is nobody. Being anxious isn't going to help you solve problems. Not that we're not going to ever be anxious, not that we're never ever going to worry, but worry and anxiety by themselves, they don't do anything. It doesn't add to your life. Let me move back here to just one screen for a moment. Okay. Worst case scenario thinking doesn't add to your life. In fact, it subtracts from it. So what I want to do this morning is unpack some of the effects for just a little bit. So what are the effects of worst case scenario thinking? What does it do? So there's 5 things in particular I'm going to cover, and it's likely, I'm sure if a psychologist was to unpack this, there'd be many, many more, but these are 5 things that I see, and what I'm going to do is put those up on the screen as I talk. Okay, so what does worst case scenario thinking do? First of all, it increases stress. Again, it's one thing to say, how will I handle X if it happens? That's normal, healthy functioning to think about different scenarios and to be prepared to respond to those scenarios. It's another thing to obsess with the worst possible outcome. The fact is that this stymies productive thinking, first of all, and it increases the stress responses. For example, we know physically, weight gain, less sleep, fatigue, things like that. And so it increases stress when you think about the worst possible scenario, the worst case scenario, and it doesn't do anything positive. The second thing is it causes division. If you imagine the worst that can happen, oftentimes it's directed toward people, their actions. Right now, worst case scenario thinking centers partly, obviously part of it's COVID, part of it is centered around the election. And people are making huge, sweeping statements. I hear people left and right saying things like, we can't survive another 4 years of Trump. Or from the right, electing Biden means the end of the U.S. And some of you watching are thinking, well, yeah, it would, depending on where you're coming from. If you're obsessed with the worst someone or some party or some group can do, how do you end up working with them at some point? At some point, we have to move past this. At some point, we have to work productively and constructively as a nation. If you're left-leaning, how do you move forward productively if Trump is reelected? And if you're right-leaning, how do you move forward in a Biden administration? We've had at least 12 years, and some would argue longer, but we've had at least 12 years of resistance from the right and now from the left. And I would ask, has this division helped us? Has worst case scenario thinking really made us a better country? Did electing Bush in 2000, did electing Obama in 2008, did electing Trump in 2016 lead to the immediate ending of life as we know it? I would argue probably hasn't, since we're still here. Moreover, how are you going to move forward and work with the people that you think are out to destroy the country? This kind of division leads to distrust. And so worst case scenario thinking increases stress, it causes division, and that moves into distrust. If you think about the worst thing that can happen, how are you possibly going to trust someone else? It could be dating. It could be friendships. It could be your coworkers. We begin to see others as inherently hurtful and distrustful. I mentioned a story in a sermon, this is probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. My wife and I were traveling, and we were at the airport waiting for our connecting flight, and there was a woman wearing a mask, because the masks are required in airports, and the mask said, "What about 6 feet don't you understand?" And that statement is it's so angsty, it's so distrustful, it's so divisive, it's so kind of worst case scenario thinking laden. So we distrust each other. Worst case scenario thinking, and this is the fourth one, leads us to this kind of paralyzed point where there's no risk taken, there's no living. Worst case scenario thinking eats away at our ability to live. In my experience, every great endeavor in my life has required me to risk being hurt by others in an accident, killed in travel, getting an exotic disease, or things like that. Anything you want to do in life that's meaningful or worthwhile, you're going to have to take a risk. Even going out on a first date, you have to take a risk. Entering into a relationship with someone else, you are entering and taking a risk. And here comes my wife in a car, or my son, so you're going to see somebody coming up. I'm taking the risk, recording this video live, that I get interrupted by somebody or something, and so we'll see what happens. You get my point. For example, when we took a group from beachside to Nepal on a mission trip, it was risky getting on a plane. It was risky eating food, not because Nepal is dirty, but because any kind of dietary change involves some kind of risk eating something new. We even had people go paragliding on a day off. To get the thrill of soaring over a lake in the Himalayas, they had to jump off a mountain strapped to another human and a kite, because that's really what it is. It's one big kite. And the fifth thing that worst case scenario thinking produces is instant reaction. Worst case scenario thinking, paired with the internet and cable TV and the 24-hour news cycle and instant communication and texting and Facebook and Twitter and all that, has resulted in instantaneous reaction, decoupled, uncoupled, separated from any consideration of circumstances or giving the benefit of the doubt. the instant reaction is always to assume the worst. A recent example, and this is a sensitive issue, and please understand I'm not taking sides, I'm not saying how you ought to unpack or think about it. I guess I am a little bit, but not entirely. But on Sunday, we had an African American man shot by white police officers, and it was caught on video. The instant reaction, assume the worst. Riots, a car dealership burned to the ground, a police officer hit by a brick, city vehicles destroyed. Now the reality is we don't fully understand the circumstances. It was an awful video. Let's just get that out of the way. But there was no audio. It was a short clip, and I'm asking questions like: had the police officers seen his warrants? Apparently, had warrants for his arrest. What was being said? Why were the guns drawn? What was going on? What was he reaching for in the car? Was he reaching for his ID? Was he reaching for a gun? I mean, what was going on? We don't fully understand the circumstances, but worst case scenario thinking says, obviously it must have been an execution by bad people of an innocent man. And worst case scenario thinking doesn't allow any time to get the facts and allow calmer heads to prevail. If police are in the wrong, they need to be arrested and they need to be put in jail. I think we can agree on that. But worst case scenario thinking says the reaction must be immediate and involve burning things to the ground. And friends, worst case scenario thinking is killing us. It's dividing us. It's allowing fear to dictate our responses rather than faith and trust. And today I've laid out some effects of worst case scenario thinking: increasing stress, causing division, leading to distrust, preventing us from taking risks in living, and promoting instant, sometimes awful reactions. And all of this is heavy. This is not a happy, clappy video where we're all going to settle off in the sunset. But don't worry. Thursday, we're going to start to unpack and turn the page from the negative to the positive. We're going to examine what Scripture, what the Bible has to say about worst case scenario thinking. We'll shed some light on it through Scripture, and then Friday we'll talk about living intentionally. I appreciate you watching. Tomorrow we have our Wednesday conversation. I'm going to have Angie Bush from Beachside here, and it's going to be great. In the meantime, have a great day, and God bless all of you. Take care.